worries.
Okay. Yeah, I'm good on my end.
Alrighty. Yeah, no, thank you again for agreeing to let me interview you. So I'll talk a little bit about what I do, and then we'll get into some more of what you do.
Cool.
So as of Sunday, no longer. I used to be a sustainable farming systems and food systems major at Purdue, but I have since graduated.
Okay.
How I am continuing my research for the summer on farming in climatically and environmentally challenging areas, specifically sustainable farming.
Cool.
So actually be my first interviewee for this study and catalog. So why don't you tell me a bit about who you are, where you are, and what you do?
Yeah. So I'm Steve Sanchez. I am an agave and cactus farmer and goat rancher in High Vista, California, which is northeast Los Angeles County. And I have a small farm here where I do a lot of that stuff, and I grow a lot of different plants. But then I'm also a consultant, and I help build out similar farms to mine that are also kind of applying the dry farming model. Also pretty much modeled on mine being agave, cactus, and goats, being the primary things that they're working on. And then my consulting work is, pretty much through all of California, and a lot of the past 2 years has been going global as well. So we're also consulting for people in Europe and, Africa and Latin America.
Are people in Europe adopting these dry farming models in Africa as well as a result of limited water or shifts in climate?
Yeah. So everybody is like California, I think, because we have a lot of media is kind of being this model where, for instance, everyone is seeing all of the effects, but these effects are happening globally, and they're pretty much following the same trajectory. So I'll give an example. In Italy, I set up a small agave farm and cactus farm, and I was the consultant on this project, and the area in Italy where we planted all this agave and cactus is a traditional olive and wine grape region, and they've been dealing with similar issues to California's wine grapes and olives of, because they have a monoculture and because climate change is not giving them consistent water anymore. They're all kind of dealing with the similar issues in California and Italy of plague, of just affecting these monoculture crops, and then the not having consistent water resources. So in Italy, they're not getting consistent rain, much like in California, and they're not able to pump aquifers and have reliable surface water anymore, much like in California. So it's interesting because California is going to be kind of this place where a lot of this regulation hits first, but I'm seeing it now all over the world, right? So in Africa too, there are several farms trying to plant cactus for the similar reasons that they used to plant other crops and have reliable rain, but now that rain's gone away, they're asking themselves, well, what crops can we still utilize with what's just naturally coming? So a lot of them are giving agave and cactus a chance.
Gotcha. And are these primarily ornamental varieties or varieties for consumption or manufacturing certain goods?
In California, we're doing really, I would say, everything. Most of the farmers that I work with, they really do not mind where their agave goes. So, for instance, the primary purpose that agave is used for today globally is probably, known for spirits, right, through Mexico. But when you look at Africa, their primary production or use of agave is actually for textile products and fiber production. And when you go into South America, it's similar because the largest growers of it are Brazil, and they're looking at it for fiber, not for spirits. But this is increasingly changing, I would say. Because, for instance, in South Africa, they're using agave americana, so they're using a lot of naturalized agave in Africa and Europe that might have arrived, during different points during the 1700s and 1800s. So there's dozens of different agave and cactus species that have naturalized all over Europe, Africa, Latin America, and people are starting to find out now, okay, if we need these kind of low water crops to survive in this new climate, we could utilize what we have around them. So a lot of the work that I've done in Italy is kind of gather a lot of these species that are around the country and try to, see how we could use them, much like I'm doing in California. So, I'll give an example. Some of the Indian agave researchers that I've talked to about agave and cactus, they're right now utilizing cactus for biomethane production, and the government is really incentivizing them. So they have a really cool thing that I wish, lots of other countries would copy, which is that they have researchers on small farms, and then they're helping the small farms safely produce these biofuels, and the government is, directly incentivizing them by creating on their small farms the processing. So it's like a little vertically integrated relationship where the farmers are seeing where they can put their product, and the biofuels are being created safely under researchers kind of being there and gathering all their data, and then the government is winning and because they're getting all this, biofuels, you could say. So here in California, I've experimented with biodigesters with agave and cactus and tried to, like I've ran my cooking and my heating off of just combining the same thing that I learned from my Indian friends, which is animal manures plus grinded up cactus and agave, and you throw that in a biodigester and you can create your own biomethane. So I was utilizing that on a very small scale because I don't have like a lot of the resources that I wish I had, but that's kind of where I'm seeing a lot of the global market shifting towards, trying to utilize agave and cactus for energy products now, because they've realized that potential. Like in Brazil, they're shifting over from a lot of use of the agave for fiber into biofuels as well. So that's on the Asian continent, Latin American, and even in Africa now they're starting to utilize cactus biofuels. So I think that like for instance, the biomethane could be a direct substitute for a lot of natural gas that's taken out the ground in a very unsustainable manner a lot of the times. So if you can dry farm agave and cactus, in various parts around the world and produce localized energy resources, that's very appealing to a lot of countries. I think that's why they're exploring that option, a lot of people.
Definitely. I never thought agave, at least from what I knew about it, which was already very limited to have such a global reach, especially in terms of innovation.
Oh, yeah.
When I think of agave, and I think when most people think of agave, we think of Central America and distilling.
Yep. Well, that's why I mentioned it's just dozens of species, because every country kind of has their different agaves that they're exploring. They're native from the United States, from California to Florida, all the way down into actually Peru. So pretty much all of Latin America is now realizing they have native agaves as well, and are trying to create I would say like native variety projects too, right? So like a lot of the agave and cactus I'm planting here, or a lot of people are doing this, it's similar in Mexico, they're using native varieties, and they're realizing those are the best for the dry farming.
Very nice. So the spirit or sort of process of collaboration and innovation that you see abroad with agave, you don't necessarily see here in the U.S.
No, it's actually I see a lot of it here as well. I will say among the small farmers, what I do not see is just a collaborative effort between government, farmers, and researchers to get on the same page for how they want to explore these plants. So like the best example, like once again, those Indian agave researchers, and going to the farm and telling them, you can create biofuels, plant these agave, plant these cactus, and they went to regions that were, for instance, heavily deforested, and they started planting all this agave and cactus, and they were deforested because of all the animals, right? So they went to areas that had a lot of manure and low amount of plant, you could say, because of the deforestation. So they're solving like three birds with one stone by essentially giving the farmers a viable option for selling their crop, right? And they're directly telling them, this is how you do it. This is like how to do it safely. So like in California, for instance, they're trying to regulate us and create new burdensome taxes to kind of gain, I think, control of the agave market, which, can be good and bad. But in this case, I do think it is bad because it's going to disincentivize a lot of these, polyculture dry farming methods that I'm seeing around the world, right? Because like if in California they tax you every year for agave, just that's like what they're proposing. I would want to grow a fast growing variety because I'm going to want return on my money within 4 to 5 years instead of 20 or 30 years, right? So the best crops to dry farm are the most, I would say, uncommon agave and cacti species that aren't being utilized, and the ones that are grown mostly today in monoculturalist systems are not the highest quality. They're just the fastest growing, like many of the crops. They're the ones that can just come out quickest. So I do see a lot of the collaborative effort here in California, but we just have to be cautious to not over-regulate something that can be so beneficial before it takes off, right? So I believe like if we have a lot of these dry farmers have at least a decade where there's not so much regulation, then they will inspire a lot of new farmers to come into the space. Whereas if we come out quickly with a lot of regulation, a lot of farmers may not want to grow this crop that can do a lot of great things, like sequestrate carbon and feed a lot of our animals. It's a great forage, and my home that burned down in Altadena, a big issue right now in Altadena is that heavy metals are present in the soil, and people are really worried. Agave actually is a bioaccumulator of heavy metals. Oh, wow. So it's got a lot of uses that can be explored, and if we focus on over-regulation to try to focus just on the spirits, which looking at it from one angle, I'm like, look, I do believe there should be some regulation on spirits, but on all the other uses of agave, I believe that they should be left kind of free for a little bit until they show that something not good, right? Because right now we're seeing a lot of good collaboration and people, like I mentioned, creating fuels, biomethane, biohydrogen, bioethanol. They've made biochar out of the agave. Now they're also working on turning a lot of the agave saponins into medicinal products at the pharmaceutical level. So my point is, we just don't want to destroy the market before it takes off by over-regulating it, right, in California. So.
Yep. And when you're over-regulating it in a case like that, you're also getting rid of a lot of the sustainable practices that would otherwise benefit a lot of farmers. So I know we've mentioned dry farming a couple times, but can you entail precisely what it is or how it relates to your operations and
dry farming to me is basically utilizing only the water resources that you have from the sky, right? So just basically collecting rainwater and utilizing the rain that falls to grow crops. So a lot of the time that's going to be a lot of native crops. So I'll give an example here on my farm. I'm growing a lot of native agave that's native to California and cactus native to California, because they're the ones that could take 2 to 3 inches and these extreme climates to live in the Mojave because they're from here. So a lot of plants I try, but they're not able to live in that system without my help, right? So a lot of plants, if I have to irrigate them, I'll actually give up on them and stop watering them. So dry farming to me is essentially just utilizing the water resources that you have, not tapping into surface water, tapping into aquifer resources. And with that water that falls from the sky, you're raising animals, you're raising crops, and you're still able to do a lot of things, but it's an unconventional type of crops, because a lot of the times the dry farming, you can't grow corn on this amount of rain, or you can't grow soy or what's the most common crops, right? So like in another example, in Northern California, I've worked with a lot of vineyards that dry farm grapes. In areas where you do receive 15-20 inches of rain, you can dry farm grapes if they're native California variety grapes, or if they're Israeli grapes, or if they're grapes from Iran, or different regions that are just very dry, right? So yeah, dry farming to me has a huge purpose, because I studied a lot of water policy, and I realized that a lot of California aquifer are being destroyed, and a lot of California agriculture depends on these aquifers. So we needed to shift over agriculture, right? So I'll give an example. Like, I work with a lot of farmers that are taking out thousands of acres and fallowing this land. I mean, if they were growing agave and cactus, they could instead of fallowing this land, just with the rain, dry farm native California agave and cactus, and still produce a crop. So in areas where we're going to begin to lose these groundwater resources and surface water resources, I realized that agriculture economy was going to go to zero in many places if they did not find new crops. And my farm was almost like a model, to show people, hey, we can grow a lot of these different things like, yuccas, dacilarians, agave, cacti, even goats on just rainwater, and prove to them that this model could be something applicable everywhere. Because if you could do it on 2 and 3 inches of rain in the Mojave, that means you could do it in coastal California, southern, northern. I chose, you could say, one of the worst regions on purpose, because I knew if I did it here, it could be replicatable pretty much everywhere. And now I know, for instance, I could go to the driest parts of any state practically and grow using this model. So when I work with farmers, they might be working with instead of 5 acres like me, 500 acres, and we're able to go in there and still plant lots of agave, cactus, and stuff like moringa, really drought tolerant crops that don't require pretty much any irrigation. But say it rains a lot, I'm working with a lot of these farms to capture a lot of that rain so that they can boost their production by just adding that rainwater. So dry farming, to me, a lot of people will see me sometimes out with a hose and say, oh, you're not dry farming anymore. And I'm like, this is just rainwater that it captured, right? So to me, also being intelligent with how you're capturing the rainwater, like here on every roof I have an ability to catch the rainwater, and I have rain gutters and rain barrels, and all of this just allows me to take the dry farm further, right? So a lot of the plants can live on low irrigation, but how do you have animals live year-round without having a water source? You need to be able to capture a lot of that rain.
Definitely. No, I think back to what you said about being in the Mojave and as a result being able to apply it to a lot of situations in many states. I think that's also the case globally, definitely, as you had mentioned, especially in the face of climate change and desertification and everything we have going on right now. But I actually came across your profile, I believe, when you were amending soil within the Mojave or adding some sort of organic matter or attempting to incorporate organic matter, and I thought that was pretty cool. So in addition to managing water utilization in the Mojave, how do you attempt to create more productive soils or more sustainable soils?
So my whole goal is to try to think of the farm almost like an ecosystem or a garden, because I call it ecosystem farming because you're essentially trying to recreate an ecosystem, right? So when I would walk sometimes through areas in Jalisco, there would just be trees and shrubs like agave, cacti. A lot of these ecosystems, nobody was taking care of them and they were prospering, right? So here, when I moved to this area, I thought, okay, how can I utilize the natives and grow something in between all of them? And a lot of that I decided needed to be agave and cactus, and the goats also fulfilled a purpose of trying to replace a lot of the keystone species that were lost here. So the Mojave used to have a huge herd of pronghorns that essentially were eating the grasses, pooping and fertilizing them, the grasses, and my goats, basically by rotationally grazing them, I'm also seeing that they're boosting up this ecosystem where I haven't planted. So, I might only farm 5 acres, but I forage them, say, on 500 acres, and I'm still boosting that ecosystem as well. But on my farm, my goal was to, utilize the natives, plant low crops, medium crops that were going to be up in the canopy. So I've got, for instance, on the ground, the native, the agave, the cactus. Then I have, medium kind of trees like mulberries or, some of them right now also are, olive trees. And then I'm trying to grow taller trees as like dates and jelly palms. And all of these crops that I'm choosing are crops that don't require irrigation, if I'm able to just utilize a little bit of rainwater once in a while if I see they're sad. But for the most part, I plant them at a large enough scale to be established during a rainy season during the winter. So on the tree side, even that I'm not irrigating much, right? It's still with rainwater. But yeah, just thinking about the whole farm like an ecosystem is essentially how I'm improving that soil, because the biggest thing here in the Mojave is just the wind. So it's eroding away all your soil. So by planting so much stuff in close tandem, like I think I might have a couple feet in between a lot of my plants of, you couldn't fit a machine in there. And not that I'd want to, because there's a lot of heavy soil compaction that happens by bringing machineries in, and the soil is the most important part of the farm. And by adding, for instance, leguminous trees like palo verdes and small mesquites, they're nitrogen fixating for me, and I'm not having to fertilize a lot of these crops as well. So once again, thinking about this farm like an ecosystem, I'm not fertilizing because I have the animals and the leguminous trees and a lot of ground covers that are nitrogen fixating. And then I'm not having to water because a lot of these plants are helping each other. So the cacti are more drought tolerant than everybody. So I'm planting them close to the agave, close to the trees. And I'm noticing that when the tree and the agave doesn't have water, the cactus is sharing water with them. And they're essentially growing together and sharing resources. And then that happens on a field scale. So my goal is to fill up the field and just allow enough room basically for a person to come in with a small wheelbarrow or a small, something similar to harvest. But keep the spacing so tight, almost like an ecosystem, like if you were walking through, a savanna or a arid desert ecosystem. And all of that, I believe, is going to benefit the soil the most, because I can dig holes where, I have fields covered with all those different plants. I have lots of compost and mulch from, the trees growing here, and I have, the animals. And you can dig a hole there, and it'll be sometimes 3 months after it rains, and I have water in the top 6 inches. And all those plants are still actively growing, in the summer. Like, I give an example, it hasn't rained here in about a month. And then some of the plants prior to that, so we probably had 3 months of on and off, a little bit of, rain. Well, those plants prior to that had 8 months of no rain, and they were actively growing. So, when you create this ecosystem value and additional soil values, you're not having to go in there and not only irrigate or fertilize, but kind of just it's weird, because it's almost like the farm is farming itself. You know what I mean? It's like the ecosystem starts to take over.
Yeah, with your practices, and especially your goats replacing or sort of contributing to the roles of the native fauna, the system almost seems biomimetic. Do you take a lot of inspiration from biomimicry for your practices?
Yeah, like that's kind of the goal. Like, I try to copy nature for a lot of stuff, right? So I get, like, I tell people I'm a biomimetic farmer, because I think right now there's a lot of greenwashing going on with sustainable and with regenerative from big agriculture. And I'm even seeing it from a lot of farmers that, I used to work for, or I know, and I don't want to classify myself by something that I think is being greenwashed at the moment. But biomimetic, why I mentioned that I'm that type of farmer, is that all the inspiration here that I get is pretty much from nature, which was the core of the organic movement, the regenerative, and the sustainable. It's always the same thing. They changed the word, but at the core of it, I was trying to here create something that mimicked nature. So, one example that I can give, well, before I give that example, trying to mimic an ecosystem like nature created, right? Like, mentioning again the ecosystem type of farming, but then going even down to a small scale, like, how do I deal with a pest, right? So a lot of people planting agave today are using gopher baskets, they're using, chemicals, they're using for different weevils, during, and post treatment of really gnarly chemicals that shouldn't be honestly in people's gardens or farms or soils. And here I had a problem with ground squirrels at the beginning of my farm, and I only grew agave, and I tried traps or trying to do stuff that wasn't poisoning my soil, but there's an infinite amount of them. And I kind of just was reading a book about the desert and realized, like, I should probably grow something for them instead of trying to, like, trap them and stuff, right? Because the book was mentioning about how great they are, as they were mentioning their ability to decompact soils, right? So they were mentioning, look, nature has the ground squirrel there for a reason. The reason behind the ground squirrel is to put oxygen into the roots of a lot of these plants, create little tunnels so that water, when it rains, percolates into these plants and into the soil and into that microbiome. And they're also allowing, a lot of these fields to get aerated, basically. And, people pay big money to bring in machines to aerate, right? So my point is, the ground squirrel gives a lot of benefits, right? That's why nature created it. Like, it has a purpose. So I said, okay, the ground squirrel is something good. How can I change my mentality from I'm trying to attack this plague of ground squirrels and solve it? And by solving it, I basically brought in a bunch of different native cactus that grew right next to it and in between the agaves. And at first I thought it was not a success because a lot of them were starting to get eaten and bitten very heavily. But then I got a small rain, and all those agaves that were bitten to the ground or bitten even halfway, they all came back and produced tons and tons of pads. And I was telling my friend, I'm like, if a core of the agave gets eaten by a ground squirrel, it's game over. I lost that agave. But the whole penca or the whole leaf of the cactus could be eaten, and it'll come back. Even if it hasn't rained and you give it a little rainwater, it'll come back most of the time. And I realized this is the solution. Feed the ground squirrel. And then I made him, not only get off of my agave by growing another additional crop of cactus, and now I was starting to sell cactus and grow that crop. I made the gopher or the ground squirrel my researcher, because I knew wherever I saw the gopher or the ground squirrels on my farm or other farms, that's where the soil was most compacted. So that's where I knew to supplement with compost and mulch and bioactive materials, you could say, right? So I made it unpaid researcher to go and find the soils that were lacking in nutrients, and me then coming in, planting a couple cactus, try to maintain them there, and actually, instead of trying to keep them away, I'm trying to bring them in more, because I'm like, show me where I'm lacking, and that is very much how I look at a lot of the things here, right? So if I have a lot of wind, okay, let's try to plant. I just planted over 100 cactus on one of my corners of my farm where I get a lot of wind, to try to create a windbreak, right? So nature doesn't just try to stop the wind with a block wall or something. It creates natural barriers, and trying to mimic a lot of what nature does will not only save you money, but it'll just improve your system significantly, and then it just makes everything a lot easier, right? Because when you're battling a lot of these pests, like I'll give the other example of the big one with the agave weevil, right? They have a lot of this agave weevil in a lot of places because it's a monoculture of agave tequiliana. I have agave weevil on some of my agaves, but I have 40, 50 different types planted on my farm, and a whole bunch of different palms and fruit trees and shade trees and leguminous, and then the cacti. So if one cactus gets a plague like the weevil, it never spreads. It doesn't go anywhere but that agave, essentially, because I never plant a whole row of just only that agave. So essentially, it's not that I don't get the plague, but the plague doesn't affect me at all. Because when I lose one agave, I take one out of my greenhouse and I just go fill that spot up again. But when they get one agave with the plague, it destroys their whole field. So there's been about 3 instances in Jalisco's history where the agave industry and the tequila industry almost got wiped out. Like they lost anywhere from 20 to 40% of the whole agave harvest because of this, a pest. Whether it was the weevil or whether it was a little worm or a fungus. It's really the same story of monoculture really being destroyed by nature. So once again, learning from nature, I said, there's no monocultures anywhere in the world like out, in a native ecosystem. Even in a grassland, there are, trees and other different type of plants. So the closest you can get to it is still very biodiverse. and I told myself, I need to copy that. I need to just do what nature does. So, at first, obviously, I was doing, you could say, conventional farming. So I cleared a couple acres, and then I planted all my stuff now. But I've been bringing in seed and all this from a lot of the other lands that I have kept wild and rewilding my land. And now I have a lot of that growing in between my crops. And then, the wild land that I have, I'm planting where it's just bare sand. So it'll be like creosote, rabbit brush, a couple joshuas, and then I'll put in a couple agave and cactus there. where nature hasn't filled in yet, right? So I'm trying to speed up that filling, and then I'll bring my goats around to forage that as well, to try to boost the natives. So I'm trying to restore the little that I messed up, but going forward, I'm like, I can do side by side with nature, because I'm realizing that if you choose a lot of these dry farming crops, they can live in a managed system side by side in a lot of these natural systems, right? So for the longest, I didn't know how to keep a lot of my land wild and still like profit from it, but now I do, because the majority of my land will just be kept for animal grazing and rotational grazing. And as I mentioned, a lot of those systems, when I first started managing the goats there, I had very low grasses and really unhealthy plants, and now a few years along, I'm seeing all the grasses fill in, them being taller, the plants being greener, the Joshua trees being a lot healthier, and what I'm saying is that land could be kept wild and still be very profitable if you know how to utilize it. So I'm managing the animals on a lot of my land that way, and then on other portions planting with along the natives as well, because I realized as I was seeding all those natives, they have a lot of value too. So all these native nurseries that I was talking with, I started selling, native agave or native cactus to them, and I said, oh, I can grow all the native things out here. I can grow the creosote, the rabbit brush, the Joshua trees. So now I have a greenhouse just full of all California natives, because not only am I, like I mentioned, restoring my land a little bit, but I'm realizing that the seed, the plant, and a lot of the leaves of a lot of these native California plants are very valuable. So, people are making different salves and balms out of the creosote, out of the yucca. A lot of people are eating the flowers and the seeds. And my point being that there's no reason to bulldoze a native ecosystem to farm if you can directly profit off those native crops, put your crops side by side, or move animals through it, right? So a lot of that stuff is what I'm trying to teach people too, because then we don't have to get rid of an ecosystem to farm. We can just actually improve that ecosystem, right? So if it's missing, like I mentioned here, the pronghorns, in the middle of this country, they're missing a lot of, the bison herd. So cows work in a great system, rotationally grazing in that area as well, right? So you see what you're missing and try to improve that instead of basically just wiping it clean slate, right? Because I'll give an example. You can't dry farm if you get rid of the natives. Like, if you just clear everything and you try to plant cactus and agave, you'll have to irrigate it. Like one of my new farms, he asked me, should I bulldoze everything and leave it a clean slate for you? And I told him, no, don't bulldoze it. And he's like, why? Should I mow it? And I said, no, don't mow it. And he's like, why? It's not going to look like a farm. And I went in there and planted all the agave, right? No jackrabbit pressure. I drove in there after the first week. Swear to God, I probably saw like 30 jackrabbits scramble. No pressure on the agaves. And I'm telling him, this is a proof of my system now, that you can directly come in and plant alongside the natives, and the animals, they're not going to attack your crops, one, but they stay around, and then that ecosystem is just improving instead of being wiped out, right? So yeah, he can now dry farm because a lot of those natives also lock in the water for that agave, right? So if it was just dirt and the agave, then you're going to have to irrigate it heavily, which is a problem. Like right now in California, sorry to go off on this tangent real quick, but in California, a lot of the large farmers are irrigating with 6 inches of water, which when you do out the calculation, if there's just 1,000 of these large-scale farmers putting 6 inches of water on their agave fields instead of dry farming it, we're going to be using about 1/7 the water that comes in to Los Angeles. So almost a whole Colorado's river worth of water going to LA is what would be used by the agave industry, which is added water pressure we can't take. So we can have thousands of dry farm agave farms, but if we have thousands of agave farms that are, just abusing the aquifer, it's going to be horrible.
Yep. I feel like we really need a revolution of market in order for people to embrace more native and diversified ways of planting and farming, because as we currently exist, monoculture is more so a remnant of colonialism in the
100%. I don't know if you know about this restaurant called Sioux, Sioux, but the whole menu is like Native American menu where they use all crops, grown in the area, and they try to cook it in a lot of the ways that they used to cook it, so it tastes similar. And my point is, when you have a restaurant like that, that's when I get excited, because I'm like, if restaurants like that are building demand for these native plants and native diets, then farmers are gonna, let's grow it, And we need to work with, like me as a farmer, with restaurants like that, and them work with farmers like me, because then we can, really, to get to your point, blow this up. Because we need that market.
Yep. As we move towards things like, I agree, the greenwashing of sustainable agriculture, and we sort of rephrase it as the future and innovative, these practices are all not at all new, and they've been practiced by indigenous peoples here in America for a long time. So I know Los Angeles in particular is the land of the Chumash, the Tatavian, and other tribes, but in what ways at all have you worked to incorporate indigenous knowledge, or just community in general, in any facet of not only the operation but also your life?
Yeah, so I mean, my Guatemalan side of the family grew agave in Guatemala, and my Mexican side grew it in Mexico, and a lot of the family comes from indigenous areas that still, they don't speak any Spanish. Many of these areas in Guatemala and Mexico, they speak their own native languages, but that's also why I got inspired to try a lot of these ways of getting more into ecosystem farming or stuff like this, because I realized it's not like we need to reinvent the book or innovate or create all these new practices. I was just literally talking with my grandpa, talking with elders, and realizing, they have all the solutions. Like, they literally were doing it great just a few generations ago in the majority of the world. It just, slowly over the past 100 or 200 years, most of the world has shifted over to conventional farming, where they use tractors and they use chemicals and monocultures. But prior to that, I give the example of my family in Guatemala and Mexico. They were growing a diverse, polyculture of trees and agave and cactus, and in Guatemala, different types of things like avocados and fruit trees. It was all ecosystem, right? So I realized quickly by talking with the elders, all this knowledge is in indigenous cultures, right? And then it really hit me, because I said, I started profiting a lot off of agave and doing really well with it by utilizing these systems. And then I told myself, when I saw a lot of this greenwashing of sustainable and permaculture, all of these words, I said it's really a shame, because it really should just be called like indigenous knowledge, and people should be just putting them on, you know what I mean? Because it really is a celebration every time you do this of indigenous knowledge, because they, for thousands of years, developed these systems that I, thank God, knew a grandpa who got me introduced to them. And now I go down the rabbit hole, right? But also going to the point that if this is indigenous knowledge and not a bunch of new things coming out the universities, it's just more the universities finding this knowledge instead of creating it, then we need to give a lot of recognition to these indigenous peoples, right? So a big problem right now in California is that indigenous Mexicans that were the people that for thousands of years made these spirits or this pulque or these alcohols, they're being forgotten when it comes to the conversations around how this industry should be developed. And then, over on the USA side, we have, a 2,000-3,000 year history of agave, and up to a 7,000 year history of yucca, which is very similar to agave. Like, up until the 60s, they were in the same family, and then it got reclassified. But we have thousands of years of history of use of these plants, even in the United States. And I wouldn't know about agave showy, Deserti, utahensis, these California native agaves, if those indigenous Californians didn't continue growing them to allow me to once again have the ability to go and pick one of these up today and say, I want to grow it, right? Because they, for thousands of years, cultivated them, roasted them, and utilized them so that people still, by the time it got to us, had the plant around, right? So a big thing that I'm trying to work on is just recognizing I need to be talking more with a lot of these indigenous groups in California, in Arizona, in Mexico, and making sure not only are they on the table to have these conversations with, like the California Agave Alliance that I'm a part with, or any legislation that is pending, because if not, they're just going to be forgotten. So, like in California, there's a lot of legislation on agave right now trying to be proposed, and there hasn't been not one communication, outside of just maybe a couple farmers like me, but I'm talking as groups, right, that are representing a lot of agave farmers or distillers. None of them have reached out to, for instance, the Morongo tribe, or reached out to the Paiute, or they're not asking them about what's your opinion of us regulating a crop that you've grown for thousands of years, and then they're also, how I told you, with a lot of these regulations and taxes, almost trying to colonize the plant that they're benefiting from, right? Because if I can't grow showy, Deserti, utahensis, Americana, which is native to Texas, or parviflora, native to, different areas, like I think Sonora, but, Puri, which is native to right here in Arizona. If I can't grow these species because they take 15, 20 years because of overburdensome regulation and taxes, they've effectively silenced, like, the indigenous, like, culture, because they can't practice that use of that crop without the crop, and they're not going to grow the crop if it's so disincentivized to do so. So a big thing right now that I'm trying to do is grow, like I mentioned, from seed, a lot of California, Arizona, Texas native agaves, with the direct intention of, say I grow 10,000 plants. When they're ready, I'd like to look for these different indigenous communities and directly, not even sell them the plant, just here's 1,000 agave Deserti, and the reason being is this, that I feel guilty using the plant and they're not using the plant. You get me? Mm-hmm. It's like that's going to be a way that I feel good giving back to them, because I give an example. Here, in April, they have an agave roasting in San Bernardino, indigenous communities, and they have people from the Morongo tribe come, and essentially they tell me, we wish we could have more roast. We wish we could share this culture more with our people and teach them about the agave and different crops like this, but we don't have very many of them. You know what I mean? So my intention with trying to give a lot of these plants back to those indigenous that I learned from is also giving them back their culture in a sense, because again, if they don't have the plant, they can't do these roasts, eat their own crop, or agave, as I mentioned, was utilized to make a lot of clothes and fiber textiles, and they can't utilize these things anymore if they don't have it. So that's something I'm actively working on and trying to get more people to kind of hopefully sign on to that. If you grow a bunch of California natives, then trying to put 5-10% of that back in the indigenous hands, and seeing what good comes out of that. But I think it would be something good.
Definitely. I think, and that's wonderful work. That's wonderful, wonderful work. I think not only the recognition of indigenous knowledge is important in this case, but also providing the support and providing the authority. What I've seen through my time in undergrad in agricultural research, especially in Indiana, where it's primarily white, is that there is a lot of white authority when it comes to talking about sustainable or indigenous knowledge practices, which should not exist at all. We need indigenous researchers and voices in those positions of authority to pave the way after what's been ruined, so that we can have a sustainable future.
Here in California, they just passed here in California, they just passed a law to allow indigenous to create small fires to try to hold off a lot of these larger fires. And I was really stoked that law passed, but my point is, slowly they're realizing that they need to put more power back into the indigenous, because they know how to take care of this land a lot better than we do. Like it's not like we should be inviting them to our table. It's like we should be helping them create the table and us being at their table.
Yeah, very much so. That's ideally, I would like my, now that I'm graduated, my field of study to be, if I go to grad school with Trump and funding and everything. I don't know how that's looking.
But, it's all up in the air. I think utilizing a lot of the native crops is big, because it's like, on the East Coast, right, a lot of people don't even know about the pawpaw tree, right? But that's a tree that could be dry farmed in a lot of the East Coast, and great crop, can be utilized, to create a high value product, and not a lot of people have it. So it's a great crop for farmers. But my point is, if we don't know a lot of these things that the indigenous do about the native crops, then we're not going to be able to dry farm everywhere, right? So once again, reaching out to them and making sure that they have ability to share this knowledge and feel like they're not being robbed of it, I think that's the way to do it. All right. Sorry, you got disconnected, I think, for a second.
Oh, no. You're all good.
No, but it's really important, the indigenous portion. Right now, the California Agave Alliance, we're actively having discussions about that ourselves, because we want to make sure that, like I said, they're at the discussions, but then also we realize they might not agree with a lot of this industry, so we also want to make sure how to be the most respectful, if we're utilizing a lot of their practices or agave or things like that.
Absolutely. See, I think that is most of the questions I had for the catalog. Thank you so much for being my first interviewee, and thank you for being so
no worries.
patient. I don't interview so often.
Yeah, it's all good. No worries. Yeah, I love talking about dry farming and stuff, so I hope more the reason I talk with people about it is so that it gets out to more people, because I think it's a great I tell people, dry farming is the past and the future. Conventional is just this blip. It's this small blip, but we're realizing it really quickly here in California, because we're losing the aquifers everywhere. So if they lose the water, I'll give an example. In Sonoma County, or around Sonoma, Lake Berryessa area, they're trying to get rid of 75% of Lake Berryessa's water and take that away from the farmers, and to they say help the ecosystem more, which it's its own thing, but going off what they say, the agriculture economy would crash there, right? Because if they lose 75% of their surface water, it's they're going to be done. But I'm trying to tell people more about dry farming because I'm like, in these regions, they could dry farm agave and cactus and yucca and dacilarion and fucarea and all types of different genuses, and they don't have to lose that economy if they shift. And it's better to shift ahead of time than when, they tell you there's no more water, So I decided before the aquifer was destroyed here to shift, because that's going to be the future. In many regions, they won't have surface or aquifer water anymore, either through regulation or literally they'll get rid of it like themselves, right? So they'll drain the aquifer or the surface water dry, which is happening as well in many regions. So like I mentioned, through regulation or through the farmers, that water is gone. They need to just shift. And dry farming is going to be the way for agriculture to go forward and not have a setback, but actually, how we were talking about the ecosystem, improve, right? Like the economics, the ecosystem, the people, it can all improve.
As I like to say normally, the future is very much in the past. We just need to actually enact it.
100%, yeah.
Oh, yeah. Well, again, thank you so much. Let's see, did you have any questions for me?
If you get any questions, you can just always email me or, send a message or something, but I'm cool on my end, yeah.
Wonderful, thank you.
All right, thank you. Have a great rest of your day or night over there. Sorry, it's probably already, the sun's gone already over there.
Thank you.
Have a good one. All right, bye-bye.